All right, welcome everyone to another SETI Facebook Live. I'm here with the FDL team. Frontier Development Lab is an applied artificial intelligence research accelerator, and we bring the brightest minds from around the world in space science and exploration domains, and we pair them with machine learning researchers to tackle problems in the areas of heliophysics, astronaut health, lunar exploration, and earth science. This is our 5th year of the FDL program that is hosted by the SETI Institute and in partnership with NASA, and the first year that we are taking it virtual. We have 8 teams this year at FDL US, and they're going through our 8-week program, and we are currently on week 4 of 8 weeks, and we are in the calibration phase. Today, I have with me our Knowledge Discovery Framework team. So I'm going to kick things off with some introductions. So I'm going to go ahead and Nishan, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Nishan Srishankar. I'm currently in Santa Clara, California. I'm studying robotics at Worcester Polytech Institute, and I'm working on algorithms for multi-robot systems, and I'm bringing in an aspect of deep learning, machine learning as well to those algorithms. All right.
Great. Thank you, Nishan. All right. Going to go over to Megs.
Hi, I'm Meg Seeley. I am a graduate student at Arizona State University in Phoenix, Arizona. And I focus on bringing together remote sensing and conservation.
Wonderful. And I'll turn it over to Satyarth.
Hi, everyone. I'm Satyarth Praveen. Right now, I'm studying robotics at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm also a graduate student, and my field of work is computer vision mainly.
Great. Good to have you. And we have Francesco.
Hi, everyone. I'm Francesco Civilini, and I am a NASA postdoctoral program fellow in Huntsville, Alabama at Marshall Space Flight Center. And I'm a seismologist by trade, and I'm currently applying AI techniques to planetary science.
Great, thank you. And thank you for all of you that are joining us as viewers. It looks like so far we have some folks joining us from Jacksonville, Florida in the UK. Really excited to have you guys with us. And to go ahead and kick off learning more about the Knowledge Discovery Framework team, Francesco, can you tell us a little bit about the challenge this year?
Absolutely. So our objective is actually deceptively simple. We want to create a reverse image search algorithm for remote sensing data, so essentially satellite data. And the reason we want to do this is there's countless petabytes of imagery that are located within NASA archives that have actually not been looked at by humans. And if a researcher wants to go and take a look at this information, they need some prior knowledge about where to look and if phenomena had been cataloged or not cataloged. And so our objective is to design something that you can input in a phenomenon. Let's say you're looking at a dust storm or hurricane, and you can actually get something back. You can get back the data that you want that perhaps a human has never looked at or labeled. And this can also be applied, and we're doing sort of a modular approach. So we expect it to be sort of built up on over the years to come.
Great. And can you expand a little bit about why does your challenge matter?
So it matters because when a researcher wants to actually look at this data, there's so much prior knowledge that they need to have. And so we want something that is able to not just help a researcher find what they want, but find something that they may not have seen or what we call unique phenomena. And the way we're looking at this is actually for disasters. Which is a really sort of obviously practical application. And right now for our challenge, at week 4, we're focusing on dust storms, which have been demonstrated to be an important parameter for driving hurricane genesis and strength.
Great, that's really exciting. And I want to turn it over to Megs, if you can describe a little bit more about the tools and the processes that your team is using to accomplish this goal this summer.
Yeah, so the first question that we had to ask is what data we're going to focus on and start with. Since there are lots and lots of satellites that are orbiting the Earth and taking information, we decided to go with MODIS, which is has been orbiting the Earth for about 20 years now, collecting data daily. And it takes data at about 500 meters resolution, which means that we get 500 meters on the ground by 500 meters. And that is really awesome for looking at these really large scale events and large scale phenomena like dust storms. So what we do is, because those data are continuous across the entire Earth, we cut them up into smaller manageable chunks that we call tiles. And then we feed them into a neural network. And this neural network starts to learn things about the data. It starts to learn what features look like. It starts to learn what continents look like, oceans, et cetera, et cetera. And from there, we're going to start to customize this model to start so that it can start to learn dust storms and other sorts of anomalies in the future. And so that we can eventually feed in one image of a dust storm. And what it will give back to us, this is a hope, is other images of dust storms that have occurred throughout the lifespan of the sensor and within its kind of geographic scope.
Great, thanks, Meg. And you guys are using, you have the ability to use massive amounts of compute, right? And you guys are using Google Cloud?
Yes, we are starting small. So we have started just testing things locally, but we are switching to the cloud as we start to scale up.
Great, thanks, Mix. And then I'd like to turn it over to Nishan to talk a little bit about any of the pitfalls or the roadblocks you guys are experiencing. It's on week 4, so you guys are just now starting to dive in, as Mix mentioned, starting small, and then now you guys are starting to scale things up. So what does that look like?
Yeah, so we've worked through some of our roadblocks. It all comes through the fact that we're working with unlabeled data, basically. So the first thing that we're looking at is we cannot use raw PNG images. So basically, we cannot use images that are like JPEGs or PNGs, but we need to stick to the original GeoTIFFs that you get from Modis, because we lose any spatial information. And we've also found that there are multiple occasions where your PNG images lose aspect ratio. They either stretch too much or so we lose any information when we use a raw PNG as opposed to using the original GeoTIFFs. And generally, machine learning engineers, ML engineers, they have this trick of something called pre-training, essentially, where you start off from a baseline that's pre-trained on a different data set, and you fine-tune it on your system or your data set. What we found out recently is training images from scratch actually works better for us than pre-training models. Probably because in general, pre-trained models work off a simpler data set, and our data set is a bit more complicated. You have objects that are technically shapeless. And again, coming back to the fact that we don't have labels, all of our modules in our system don't have any ground truth information. So we're figuring out, like, how can we actually know whether our system is working? How can we quantitatively evaluate it? And in general, the trained model has a tendency to sort of learn the background geographical features instead of actually learning features that we're more interested in, basically the atmospheric information or data, atmospheric phenomena. So we need to, it's one of the things we're working on, and it's to figure out a smarter way of sort of hiding geographical information, or even removing occlusions like from the data. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And I have one last question, and then we're going to go ahead and open it to audience Q&A. So Satyarth, can you share a little bit about what you guys are hoping to achieve at the end of FDL and what that also looks like for future work?
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Sarah. So what we're trying to achieve goes on a little idealistic, but we're still hopeful that we'll get there. We're trying to actually create a general featureizer. I mean, we have been talking about that we're trying to classify dust storms to start with, but imagine that, for example, for all the machine learning folks who are out there, you must, whenever you start training a model, you have ImageNet or COCO data sets to just pick up their models and get going with your your research or your project, right? But for remote sensing, that's hard to find because ImageNet, yeah, cats and dog photos cannot work for remote sensing data for satellite images, right? So we are hoping to create a general model that can be used for projects that you can build on it, right? So that's one major goal that we're trying to achieve. The other thing is, if we can, as mentioned before by Francesco, if we can create a reverse image search. For example, we have given a particular kind of dust storm, a particular kind of hurricane. If you're able to find all the similar images, that's helpful to us too, right? Especially for the researchers. And to like look at it from an opposite side, we can also find the anomalies for a given set of given pool of data. If you can find the anomalies, that's of great advantage too, right? So these are the two major things that we're trying to achieve in this very limited time frame.
That's really great. Thank you. And I wanted to also thank everybody that has joined us. We've got people from Sweden and Switzerland, South Africa, Turkey, the UK, Canada. So thank you all for joining in, and thank you to our team here for sharing a little bit more about the challenge. So like I said, I'll go ahead and open it up to Q&A from the audience, and it does look like we already have one question. So we have a question from Brett, who is wondering, how do you deal with the challenge of transporting large amounts of data between facilities and researchers? Our organization is reaching a point of data generation with few methods of moving it around. Does anybody have any suggestions?
Okay, I can take that. So these large amount of data, if you have these large amount of data that is available to you for research, generally the organizations create an instruction manual of how you can go about playing with this data. So for the Modus data that we're using, there is an entire website for what kind of data you want to use and how do you go about importing it for your project and how to fit it into your pipeline. Generally, that's the way to go.
I can add to that as well. And sort of for the more practical applications, and that part of our question is how do we as sort of researchers handle that? And it's honestly, a lot of documentation and working with subsets. So because it is not necessarily possible to transfer around 50 gigabytes of data and test something, we have to get really clever about trying to understand what would be a representative subset that would kind of translate being scaled up. Because especially in the short time that we have to work on this project, it is an extremely complicated issue.
Great. Thank you both. So we have another question. Do you have any plans to put this data out to the public to categorize? So I'll just make a note about FDL, and then I'll turn it over to you guys if you have any other thoughts. We are working on making some of our FDL data more publicly available and easier to access. So please stay tuned to that. And Megs, it looks like you have something else to share about your data.
Yeah, so the data itself, because we're using NASA Earth observation, is already public. What we would potentially share, and this is given kind of the limitations of time in the project, is that if we can create something that's working and running, the idea has been thrown out to have users start to label the data, kind of like with how Pinterest does it, where you generate a search algorithm and it gets feedback from the users as to whether or not that was useful or whether or not that's what they were trying to find. However, building a website and interface that can loop all that takes quite a bit of time and effort. So right now we're just trying to get the algorithm working and the search working, and that's our main priority as of right now.
Great, thanks, Megs. And it looks like we're waiting on some more questions. So if you're joining us, if you would like to ask a question, please go ahead and share those with us. But I will go ahead and turn over to the team. I'd love to know from your perspective what you personally have experienced through FDL or what you hope to get out of the FDL program so far. So I'll go ahead and start with Nishan.
Yeah. So the main thing is it's an interesting challenge, and you're dealing with large amounts of data that you normally, it's a bit more harder to sort of play around with the data. Plus, it's actually helpful in the long run. Like if our algorithm works, we plan on like releasing, let's say, a baseline featureize or a baseline model that someone else can use to do whatever end user task that they want to do. And I like the FDL team or this entire concept because you get to see perspectives of others. I've learned a lot from Megs and Francesco and Satyarth. Like my initial viewpoint was actually very narrow regarding remote sensing images, and then they've just blown my mind. So that is something I like. And plus, even in like the Slack channels, you get to interact with people of varying backgrounds and people who've like published so many papers, done like really significant research. And I'm like starting out in my career, and I'm like looking at them, wow, how am I like interacting with them basically? So yeah, that is me.
Great, thank you. And I'll go ahead and ask the same question of Megs.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely agree with what Nishan said about learning from everyone on the team. So I came in as more on the remote sensing side, and I've used machine learning, but I've never really used deep learning before. And so it's really awesome to be able to learn from people who know a lot about it. And we've done a lot of pair coding, which helps me in my coding in general, but also specifically focused on deep learning. Definitely because of COVID and everything that's going on, there's been a lot of learning how to interact on a team in this like short amount of like time with a really intense project and goal on Zoom, since none of us are in the same location. So that's also been an interesting learning process that I'm sure a lot of other people are going through and will be very helpful in the future as this continues to be our norm.
Great, thanks, Megs. I know that I'm certainly learning a lot as well. Great, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Satyarth.
The one thing that I want to add is, actually Nishan and Megs already mentioned it, but yeah, we did have like sticking to our field and the projects we did, if having restricted to the same domain, we did have a narrow-minded approach to some project. And just 2 days back, we were having this discussion regarding the limitations of the current approach with our project. And some of our domain researchers, they mentioned that some of the things will just not work. And if we just move forward with the machine learning or deep learning mindset, we can try to learn it, but it just might not work. So these are some things that we're getting used to, and they're really nice to have in a team.
That's great. Yes, interdisciplinary is key. So I'll turn it over Francesco.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a great experience, and it's not very common to, when you're working on a sort of a research sprint like this, to interact with people from so many different backgrounds, and you get to really learn from so many different people and with different expertises, and which is honestly, I haven't had that many opportunities to do this. And when you're working on something that's as challenging as this, but for me, for example, I'm a seismologist, and one of the ways that I can kind of come in and look at this is because I have a little bit of experience with computer vision for my own work, and so you're applying this thing that you know, but in a different context, and you're applying this with people that also might come from a different context, and you can actually create something unique and something very new, and I've really enjoyed the experience so far.
Great. And it looks like we have a question from the audience. So is the product of this mainly for researchers, or are there practical implications for the general public? So Francesco, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you first, and then I'll go and turn it over to Megs.
Yes, so right now, the way that we've been approaching things is more for the researcher side. We anticipate that this, and I've used this term before, modular approach. So we're building something that's going to be a base, and that can be ideally augmented by researchers in the future. Obviously, when you're doing something like this, you can make it a lot more general and more accessible. But usually, when you do something like that, it actually decreases a lot of times technical applications. So it's a bit of a fine balance. And so what we're trying to go for is this base that can be used for researchers, but also can potentially in the future be adapted to something that a citizen scientist might be interested in looking at.
Great, thanks. And Megs, did you have a few things to add?
Yeah. And what I wanted to add is mostly just based on the fact that the data is remote sensing data, which does come with limitations because there can be barriers just in using this type of data in general. And what I would add is that the purpose of our project is to make remote sensing data more available. And from there, if it's more available and more accessible, then the idea and the hope is that more people can go ahead and use it. And so some of like practical applications of using remote sensing data are, for example, like measuring heat in cities, or in this case, being able to identify dust storms, which could lead to public health implications. It could lead into public safety, for example, if you have dust crossing roads. And then it can also be more on the research side, looking at hurricane genesis. So there are a lot of different potential applications, but the idea in general is just to create something that makes remote sensing data easier to find and use, and eliminating some of the barriers, but there are still a lot of barriers to using remote sensing data in general.
Great, thanks, Megs. And I had a question for you guys. So your question that you started out with was very broad, and you've already talked about a whole bunch of different applications for your project. Why did you guys choose to start with Sandstorms? Was it like the data available, personal interests? What made you guys focus on that for your starting point?
I can probably take that. So first point being, it's hard. And since we are like doing a project for FDL and NASA, since we're carrying the hard name tags, then we need to work on a hard problem, right? And going through the research, like literature survey that we did, literature review that we, not review, survey, right? Yeah, literature survey that we did, it is a hard problem. And today we have been going through some data, and we did face some of the cases where we ourselves had issues like coming to a decision whether what should this be. And so yeah, that's one major reason why we decided to work on that, because if our model is able to solve a hard problem, it's easier to make the claim that it'll be able to figure out easier problems, right? So that's my take on it.
Wonderful, that's a great answer. Thank you. It looks like we have another question from the audience. So we talked about like the Earth applications of your project, but are there any implications for space research?
So this one is a little bit trickier because the data that we're working with is optical data. So we're working in things that we can see in red, green, and blue. And there aren't, I don't know, I'm not as familiar with remote sensing in space, but as far as I'm aware, there are very few, if any, sensors that work in red, green, and blue in space. And so directly transferring what we're doing to space will be difficult just because it's not quite the same thing. So a lot of times in space, there's a lot of radar, which is a different type of imagery, and maybe in some ways can be adapted, but it would take a little bit of growing pains.
Great. Go ahead, Satyarth. I think you had a couple of other things to say.
Again, coming back to our desired outcome. So if we are able to create what we are working on, if we have a general model, then maybe we'll, if our satellite is, taking pictures of some other planet, for example, Mars, obviously. So we can start with this general model and, train it to a more specific case. But again, that's a hope. But that's that in the case of reusability, that's something we can do.
Great. Thank you, both Megs and Satyarth. That was really good. So it sounds like there would need to be a little bit of adaptation for it to be able to be applied other than the earth science realm, but this has been really great. So I'd like to thank you guys again for being able to share with us a little bit more about your challenge and the work that you're doing and the outcomes. And I look forward to seeing where you guys end up at the end of the 8 weeks. And thank you to our audience that joined us today, all of our FDL partners, and of course, thank you, SETI Institute. This has been great, and I appreciate everyone joining for this Facebook Live.